Today's video compiles 8 of the worst cave tragedies covered on this channel. In one story, during a rope climb, a large rock breaks loose, falling with a massive speed, crushing an explorer beneath. In another story, a caver descends into a narrow opening, ignoring the danger, and gets trapped when the rocks above him suddenly shift, crushing his body. Not just this, but this video is filled with more disastrous stories. Stick till the end. And as always, viewer discretion is advised. A team set off on their adventure on a warm summer morning, feeling excited and relaxed, with no reason to worry about what lay ahead. Bob Zimmerman, a seasoned caver who had explored MCF's cave many times, led the group. With over 24 trips under his belt, he knew the cave inside and out. His friends, Richard Borowski and brothers Luis and Mo Esperanza, were just as eager to explore. They entered through the locked gate, carefully placing the key on a ledge so they wouldn't lose it. This was a common practice among cavers to make sure they could always get back out. Inside, a small stream ran through the cave, about 3 to 4 feet deep, normal for this time of year. Everything seemed calm and safe as they moved deeper inside, reaching Cone's Dome by mid-morning. At 11:30 a.m., they left their climbing gear on a high ledge, assuming they wouldn't need it again until they returned. After hours of exploring, the group decided it was time to head back. Around 4:30 p.m., they guessed they'd be out by 7:30 p.m., giving them plenty of time to finish their adventure without rushing. Zimmerman and Borowski were moving at a slower pace and took a short break in the first breakdown room, about 3,500 feet from the cave's entrance. Luis and Mo went ahead. But while the group was making their way back, something dangerous was happening above them. A powerful storm rolled in, dumping heavy rain onto the already soaked ground. With nowhere else to go, the water rushed into the cave's drainage system, filling the tunnels with fast-moving water. Some caves have been known to flood in just minutes after a heavy rainstorm. That's why experienced cavers always check the weather before heading underground. As Zimmerman and Borowski kept moving, they noticed something terrifying. The stream was rising fast. Just hours ago, it had been a small trickle, but now it had turned into a rushing current. The force of the water made walking nearly impossible, so they had to climb above it using a tricky technique called chimneying. This meant pressing their hands and feet against opposite walls to stay above the flood. It was slow and exhausting. There, they found Luis and Mo Esperanza waiting for them. But things had gotten even worse. The water had risen to 6 feet, turning the passage into a dangerous river. The Esperanzas were huddled on a ledge above the water, anxious for their friends to arrive. However, getting to them wasn't easy. Borowski struggled to climb up because the walls were too slippery, and the water's force made it even harder. Working together, the group managed to pull him to safety. Now reunited, they took stock of their situation. They were still over 2,000 feet from the entrance, and with the floodwaters rushing through the cave, trying to move forward could be deadly. The safest choice was to wait. Huddled on the ledge, wet and shivering, they watched the water carefully, hoping it would go down soon. By 7:30 p.m., there was a little hope. The water had started to recede, but it was agonizingly slow. It took until 11 p.m. for it to drop just 2 feet, making travel only slightly easier. Knowing they couldn't stay forever, they decided to push ahead, using chimneying to stay above the water when they could. The journey toward Cone's Dome was slow and exhausting, but they knew it was an important checkpoint on the way out. They reached the dome just before midnight, only to find bad news. The waterfall inside had grown into a roaring torrent, making it impossible to climb. Left with no choice, they retreated to an area called Dreamland, where they could wait on higher ground. The hours dragged on as the cold and damp air drained their energy. Their wet clothes offered little warmth, and without proper protection, they started to fear hypothermia. Making things worse, their carbide lamps, essential for both light and a bit of heat, were running dangerously low on fuel. As their lights flickered, their situation felt even more hopeless. Desperate to stay warm, the group got creative. They used plastic bags as makeshift hats and shirts, hoping to trap some body heat. It helped a little, but they were still cold and miserable. As they sat there shivering, their minds drifted to past tragedies in MCF's cave. They had heard stories of climbers who didn't survive trying to cross waterfalls in similar conditions. As much as they wanted to escape, waiting was still the safest choice. However, their bodies were running out of energy, and fear of the worst crept in. By 1:40 a.m., the water had dropped another 3 inches. Not much, but enough to give them hope. They knew they couldn't wait forever. Their strength, both physical and mental, was fading fast. It was now or never. Pushing through exhaustion, they carefully approached the waterfall at Cone's Dome. The climb was brutal. Water was still crashing down on them, making every step slippery and dangerous. They had to move with complete focus. When they finally reached the ledge where their climbing gear was stored, they were relieved to find the key to the gate still there. If the flood had washed it away, they would have been in serious trouble. With new determination, they pressed forward. Wading through the last flooded sections drained what little energy they had left, but they didn't stop. They just kept thinking about getting out. Finally, after hours of struggling, they reached the entrance gate and unlocked it. At around 5 a.m., they stepped outside into the cool morning air. The storm had passed and everything was quiet. The nightmare was over. After nearly 18 hours trapped underground, they were exhausted, freezing, and completely drained, but alive. As they stood there catching their breath, they realized that their teamwork and smart decisions had saved them. Caves can flood incredibly fast because water doesn't soak into the rock. It just rushes through the tunnels. Looking back on the ordeal, Zimmerman admitted he had never seen MCF's cave flood in the summer before. The heavy rain, combined with already soaked ground, had created a rare and dangerous situation. If they had tried to fight against the flood instead of waiting, things could have ended very differently. Their patience and smart choices, like using plastic bags to keep warm and watching the water levels closely, had likely saved their lives. On the crisp morning of October 17, 2009, a group of 4 experienced cavers, led by 45-year-old John Haber, gathered at the middle entrance of Fang Cave. Alongside John were Mike Nash and 2 other members of the Alpine Club, all skilled adventurers who had spent years exploring the hidden labyrinths beneath the Earth's surface. The team began their descent by rigging the entrance pitch into a massive chamber known as the Colosseum. Using a sturdy bolt hanger and a camming device, they secured a doubled 9mm dynamic rope to ensure a safe climb down. The Colosseum was awe-inspiring. Its vast, echoing space making the cavers feel small as they prepared to push deeper into the cave. From there, they moved into the Corkscrew, a steep winding passage that lived up to its name with its tight twists and turns. Navigating the Corkscrew required skill and precision. The team rigged an 11mm dynamic rope around a large column at the top of the passage, carefully placing a camming device into a crack about 10 feet above a ledge for extra safety. As they descended, the air grew cooler, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The Corkscrew was no joke. It demanded focus and teamwork, with every step requiring careful planning. Caving ropes, like the ones used by John's team, are specially designed to handle the unique stresses of vertical descents. The camming device they'd secured allowed 2 climbers to move up or down at the same time, keeping the rope taut and safe. It was a clever setup, designed to prevent accidents in the unpredictable twists of the cave. After a careful descent, the team finally reached the base of the Corkscrew, a section of the cave that had tested their skills and stamina. They knew they were now deep inside Fang Cave, where the air felt heavier and the walls seemed to press closer with every step. The upper part of the Corkscrew had been tricky, but the lower section was even tougher. The passage grew steeper and narrower, forcing the team to squeeze through tight spaces and adjust their positions constantly. Finally, they reached the farthest point of their planned exploration. The cave's atmosphere was intense. The walls seemed to close in, and the air felt thick and damp. The team exchanged glances, a mix of pride and unease in their eyes. They'd made it this far, but now came the hard part, the climb back up. Everyone knew the ascent would be even more grueling than the descent, demanding every ounce of their strength and focus. After spending some time at the base of the corkscrew, the team knew it was time to head back. Climbing out would be the toughest part of the journey, but they were ready. John Haber, the group's leader, took the lead, carefully making his way up the steep, twisting passage. As he reached the section where the relay cam had been placed, he noticed something was wrong. The cam had shifted from its original position in the crack, putting the rope's security at risk. John acted quickly, repositioning the cam and securing it firmly back into the crack. He called down to Mike Nash, telling him it was safe to start climbing. This was standard procedure in vertical caving. One person climbs while the other waits, ensuring everyone's safety. Mike was ready, but as soon as he put his weight on the rope, disaster struck. The crack holding the cam suddenly gave way. The pressure from Mike's weight caused a large rock flake, precariously balanced in the crack, to break loose. It fell with terrifying speed, slamming into John with brutal force. The impact sent him crashing down to the ledge below, the sound of the falling rock echoing through the cave like a thunderclap. In caving, rockfalls are one of the most unpredictable dangers. Even the most stable-looking formations can shift under pressure, especially in caves with loose or weathered rock. That's why cavers always double-check their gear and anchors, but sometimes nature has other plans. The team froze for a moment, the shock of what had just happened sinking in. John was pinned under the massive rock, his body lying in a shallow pool of water. The impact had knocked him unconscious, and to the team's horror, he wasn't breathing. Using every ounce of strength, they worked together to lift the heavy flake off his body. It was a desperate struggle, but they managed to free him. John, however, was unresponsive, his body limp and lifeless. The reality hit them hard. Their friend, their leader, was in critical condition. The rock had broken 7 ribs on his right side and 3 on his left. His collarbone and clavicle were fractured, and one of his lungs had collapsed. His right shoulder and hand were also badly injured. The team was faced with a nightmare scenario deep inside a cave with no easy way out. In caving emergencies, every second counts. Rescuers often use specialized techniques like vertical litter evacuations to safely transport injured cavers out of tight spaces. These methods require intense coordination and training, as even a small mistake can make a bad situation worse. The team knew they had to act fast. John's life depended on it. Without hesitation, they started CPR, working frantically to bring him back. Their quick thinking and determination paid off. John slowly regained consciousness. But it was clear he was badly hurt, his body broken and battered from the crushing weight of the rock. Meanwhile, another group of cavers, led by Tamara Costa, had entered the cave. They were new to caving, but familiar with the cave system. As they descended into the Colosseum, they ran into a member of John's team, who explained that there had been an accident and the group would be delayed. Tamara and her team decided to continue their exploration, unaware of the severity of the situation. But when they reached the top of the corkscrew, Tamara realized they didn't have enough rope to make the full descent. Frustrated but cautious, she called off their plans and started heading back toward the entrance. Little did she know her decision to turn back would soon play a crucial role in the unfolding drama. As Tamara Costa and her team were making their way out of the cave, a member of the Alpine Club's group came rushing toward them, shouting that someone had been crushed by a rock and was in critical condition. Tamara's heart sank as she realized the seriousness of the situation. Without hesitation, she sent one of her team members to grab the satellite phone stored at the cave entrance. That phone was their lifeline to the outside world. Once the satellite phone was in hand, Tamara made the call. It connected to a Globalstar center in Texas. which then relayed the message to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, in Prince George. This single call set off a chain reaction, mobilizing a full-scale search and rescue operation. Help was on the way, but time was running out. While waiting for the rescue teams to arrive, Tamara focused on keeping John as comfortable as possible. She had extra clothing brought to the accident site, carefully moving him out of the cold water and into a semi-sitting position to help keep him warm. Every small action mattered. John's survival depended on it. The British Columbia Cave Rescue, BCR team, was on its way, but until they arrived, it was up to the cavers on the scene to keep hope alive. The cave rescue operation kicked into high gear around 7:00 p.m. when 2 helicopters touched down, delivering rescue teams and essential equipment to the site. By then, John had lost consciousness again, his breathing shallow and labored. The team feared the worst. His injuries were severe, and time was slipping away. At 8:15 p.m., the rescue team carefully moved John onto a spinal immobilization device, securing him in a Furno, Washington stretcher. This specialized equipment was designed to support his broken body and prevent any further damage to his spine. The rescuers began the grueling task of hauling John out of the cave. Using a complex system of ropes, pulleys, and rigging, they inched their way up the steep, narrow passages. It was slow, painstaking work, but every movement was deliberate to keep John safe. By 9:30 p.m., they reached the Coliseum, the massive chamber where the journey had begun hours earlier. There, they noticed something remarkable. John's breathing improved when his head was elevated. They propped the stretcher against a large boulder, added heat pads to fight off the cave's chill, and adjusted his position to make him as comfortable as possible. Though exhaustion weighed heavily on the team, they pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that their efforts could mean the difference between life and death for John. Finally, after hours of relentless effort, John was loaded into a waiting helicopter. The sound of the rotor blades cutting through the night was a symphony of hope. He was flown to safety and rushed to the hospital, where doctors confirmed the extent of his injuries: 7 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and multiple fractures. It was a miracle he had survived. Goulle du Pont is a cave located in the Ardèche and Drôme regions in southwestern France, near Bourg-Saint-Andéol. It sits under a viaduct of the SNCF and is part of a larger hydrological system that drains water from the Remeze-Karadi Plateau. The cave itself is completely flooded, with a 10 to 13 foot wide entrance pool that leads into the cave. Once inside, you can experience incredible diving with crystal clear water and fascinating rock formations. The cave features many winding passageways, which make it important to have a good sense of direction. It's a spot only accessible to experienced technical divers because of the great depths. The cave has been explored to a depth of 583 feet, 178 meters, by French explorers. In late December 2000, a 42-year-old caving enthusiast named Wojtek Szymanowski decided to learn cave diving himself. He signed up for a diving course, bought the necessary equipment, and despite promising his wife he wouldn't try cave diving, he joined an expedition in August 2001. This was led by Wiktor Bolek, one of Poland's top cave divers. Cave diving, like in Goulle du Pont, can take divers to depths where they can explore completely submerged areas. The experience often involves squeezing through narrow, dark tunnels before emerging into vast underwater chambers. It's a thrilling way to explore the hidden world beneath us. Wojtek's first big expedition took place in a resurgence in Romania, where he dived to a depth of 164 feet, 50 meters. He quickly fell in love with cave diving and worked hard to get as much training as possible. Wojtek was highly self-motivated and didn't let small challenges stand in his way. He actually enjoyed the tough moments because they made the success feel even better. By 2005, Wojtek had become one of Poland's top cave divers. Since he first started in August 2001, he'd completed many cave diving trips, both in Poland and abroad. He kept track of all his adventures on his Deep and High website. In 2003, Wojtek made nearly 30 dives, reaching a maximum depth of 337 feet, 102.7 meters, using a rebreather. In 2004, he did at least 3 dives that were almost 100 meters deep. Sadly, in May 2004, Viktor Bolek, who had been Wodek's mentor, passed away while scuba diving in a flooded quarry, reportedly from natural causes. Wodek had already been involved in research at Izbukal Taus, which had been led by Viktor. After his mentor's death, Wodek took over the project, organizing dives in August and September 2004, and again in January 2005. On April 4, 2005, Wodek traveled to the picturesque French town of Bourg-Saint-Andéol with a small group of divers, led by another diver from Wrocław. French divers were already exploring the caves there, so it wasn't exactly an adventurous, unexplored spot. It was more on the touristy side. The following day, on April 5th around 9 p.m., Wodek dove for about 80 minutes, reaching a maximum depth of 30 feet in what was likely the Goule de la Tannerie cave. One of his dive computers recorded the dive. Wodek had a real love for technology. His passion for taking risks and his interest in electronics were well known among his peers. The Goule du Pont cave, located nearby the Goule de la Tannerie, was the next cave Wodek decided to explore. He thought this would be the perfect spot to break his depth record of 337 feet, 102.7 meters, which he had set back in 2003. On the morning of that April day, as Wodek prepared for his dive, the charming town of Bourg-Saint-Andéol was certainly an appealing place to be. For the dive, he would use his trusted Buddy Inspiration rebreather, a high-tech diving system, and breathe a special gas mix called Trimix, which is designed for deep dives. The Buddy Inspiration is a computer-controlled device and is a modern alternative to the older, more traditional diving gear, used by pioneers like Jacques Cousteau. Trimix is a gas mixture made up of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium, and it's often used in deep dives to help divers avoid nitrogen narcosis, a condition that can cause confusion and poor decision-making at great depths. It's a perfect example of how technology helps make extreme activities like cave diving safer. A rebreather, when used correctly, can help a diver stay underwater longer and do more challenging dives. That morning, Wodek's rebreather had a couple of small issues with moisture, likely left over from a short dive the night before in the Goule de la Tannerie cave. But nothing serious. It wasn't enough to cause him any real concern or cancel the dive. The previous dive had also shown that the equipment was working just fine, so Wodek was confident that the dive at Goule du Pont would go as planned. On April 6, 2005, around 9:30 a.m., Wodek entered the sump pool at Goule du Pont and began his pre-dive checks. He attached 2 10-liter cylinders, weighing around 15 kilograms each, to his harness. One cylinder was filled with a 1550 Trimix, a special gas mixture, and the other with 40% nitrox, a mix of oxygen and nitrogen. If the rebreather failed while underwater, these cylinders would serve as a backup. The Trimix was meant for the deeper parts of the cave, while the nitrox cylinder was for shallower depths. After completing his checks, Wodek dipped his head below the water to double-check everything on his rebreather. By 9:55 a.m., he was ready to go, planning to dive until 3 p.m. Rebreathers are incredible pieces of technology because they recycle the air you exhale, removing carbon dioxide and adding oxygen back in, which allows divers to stay underwater longer. It's like breathing in a sealed environment where the air is constantly refreshed. Wodek was wearing a lot of heavy gear that wasn't ideal for caves, where space is usually tight. The back-mounted rebreather had a hard, yellow shell, kind of like a turtle's back, which made it harder for him to fit through low parts of the cave. The side-mounted safety cylinders added to the challenge, making it difficult for him to move around in tight spaces. While this equipment works fine in open water, caves can be tricky with all the narrow and confined spots. Luckily, the Goule du Pont cave was spacious enough for Wodek's equipment, except for one small rocky section near the entrance, about 39 feet, 12 meters down. As he descended, Wojtek focused on the cave's surroundings, but he also had a lot to keep track of. One of the most important tasks was keeping an eye on the oxygen content of the gas he was breathing. The rebreather's automated control system is supposed to keep the oxygen levels just right. But like any computer system, it has limits and can sometimes malfunction. That's why Wojtek had to constantly monitor the readings. He also needed to manually adjust the amount of gas in the rebreather to balance the pressure from the gas and the surrounding water as he went deeper or came back up. If he didn't make these adjustments, breathing would become impossible, making it a crucial part of his dive. Wojtek reached a flat passage after the rocky constriction, and the water was crystal clear that day. His helmet lights cut through the darkness, letting him see far into the cave's depths. Just 246 feet, 75 meters from the entrance, the cave took a sharp turn and dropped down at a depth of 59 feet. 18 meters. This is where the real challenge of the dive began. For anyone who's never been cave diving, you need to do more than just tilt your body down when you reach a drop like this. When diving, especially with a rebreather like the Buddy Inspiration, it's important to keep your body mostly horizontal in the water. The key to going down and coming back up is managing buoyancy. You lower your buoyancy to descend and increase it to rise. To go down, the diver deflates the buoyancy control device BCD attached to them. If you add air to the BCD, it makes you more buoyant and will help you float up. But there's a catch. As you descend, the water pressure squeezes the air in the BCD, which makes it lose some buoyancy. If you don't adjust, you'll keep sinking faster and faster until you hit the bottom. The deeper you go in water, the more the pressure increases. For every 33 feet, 10 meters, you dive, the pressure increases by 1 atmosphere, which is about the same as the pressure we feel on the surface. As Wojtek went deeper, he had to keep adding small amounts of air to his BCD to control his descent. If he added too much, he'd start to float back up, but just the right amount kept him moving down at a steady pace. For the next 197 feet, 60 meters, the tunnel followed a series of vertical steps, which is common in these types of caves. At some point though, Wojtek likely started to face unexpected problems. When he reached 164 feet, 50 meters, he probably began to feel the effects of nitrogen narcosis more than he had expected. This happens when the pressure underwater causes nitrogen to dissolve into the bloodstream, leading to a sense of confusion or euphoria. Even though he might have felt the effects of narcosis, Wojtek wasn't likely to let it stop him. He had a strong mindset and didn't let small obstacles get in the way of his goals. After the vertical steps, he reached a horizontal passage at 259 feet, 79 meters. He kept going, pushing forward into a stunning 98-foot drop, even though breathing was difficult, and the narcosis probably made everything feel even harder. Nitrogen narcosis is sometimes called the martini effect. It usually starts to kick in around 100 feet deep, but the deeper you go, the stronger it gets. At this point, Wojtek's dive had become very dangerous. The nitrogen narcosis was affecting his judgment, making it harder for him to assess what was happening and make smart decisions. Despite this, Wojtek was determined to continue. He was incredibly driven and loved facing challenges, so he decided to push forward with the dive to break his depth record. As he moved along the horizontal tunnel, he used his buoyancy control device, BCD, to keep himself balanced in the water. To go down the steep drop, he had to release a little air from his BCD to make himself sink. As he descended, the narcosis got worse, making it harder for him to use his equipment and fully understand what was going on around him. He also had to manage the pressure of the gas in his rebreather and keep his descent under control. The deeper he went, the harder it was to breathe because the gas became denser, making everything feel more challenging. Instead of drifting down the pitch at a steady pace, Wojtek found that he had to work harder just to breathe. There's some doubt about whether his rebreather could handle all the exhaled carbon dioxide at such deep depths, and he might have been inhaling some of it again. With every meter he went deeper, his situation became more dangerous. What happened next is not clear, but we can only guess based on the little information available. One possible reason for what happened next is that Wojtek just couldn't manage his buoyancy and the pressure in his rebreather at a depth between 295 and 328 feet, 90 to 100 meters, especially with the narcosis affecting him. He lost control and ended up falling down to a ledge at a depth of 344 feet, 105 meters. By the time he hit the ledge, he was likely barely conscious, but the shock from the fall or struggling to breathe might have briefly brought him back to his senses. He still had one option left though. Thanks to some adjustments made to his rebreather, he was able to switch from the main system to one of the smaller onboard cylinders. This backup system was designed so that even if the main rebreather failed, the small cylinder would still have gas left. The small cylinder was only supposed to last about 60 to 90 seconds, just enough time for him to move to the external emergency cylinder. When Wojtek flipped the switch, he was able to breathe again, but unfortunately, that's where the hope ran out. He couldn't reach his emergency cylinder. He was stuck, both physically and mentally. The mouthpiece slipped out of his mouth, and within less than a minute of switching to the backup system, he drowned. Divers often carry backup systems, like extra cylinders, to ensure their safety in case of emergencies. These safety backups are a critical part of technical diving to help divers stay safe even in extreme conditions. By 3 p.m., Wojtek still hadn't surfaced, so the surface team decided to take action. They made 2 dives, reaching a maximum depth of 230 feet, 70 meters, but they couldn't find him. Realizing the situation was serious, they contacted the rescue services. By this point, they feared the worst, and it seemed likely they would be recovering a body. The next day, a French rescue team found Wojtek's body at a depth of 344 feet, 105 meters, near the bottom of the 98-foot, 30-meter drop. His mouthpiece had fallen out, and they began the grim task of bringing him back to the surface. Authorities launched an investigation into the cause of the tragic incident, as it had occurred in France. The lead examiner asked for an expert report from a seasoned French diver, which was completed in November 2005. The report concluded that Wojtek drowned after his mouthpiece came out. The primary cause of the accident was found to be improper preparation of the gases used in the dive. The analysis explained that Wojtek had planned to breathe a 15 to 50 trimix during the dive, transitioning to a 10 to 70 trimix for the deep exploration. This mix, with 70% helium and only 20% nitrogen, was meant to help prevent narcosis. If the gases had been prepared properly, Wojtek could have surfaced earlier and possibly avoided the tragic outcome. So, the mismanagement of the gas mixture seemed to be the ultimate cause of his death. Hidden deep in the peaceful wilderness of Gilchrist County, Florida, Devil's Ears Spring is both breathtaking and dangerous. On October 9, 1992, 2 experienced cave divers, R.D. Milholland and Alan Jonas, geared up for what they thought would be just another dive. They had done this plenty of times before, earning their certifications and successfully completing dozens of dives. But even the best divers can sometimes underestimate the risks, and this particular dive would push them way beyond their limits. That morning felt like any other. Milholland and Jonas stood at the water's edge, going over their dive plan. It was supposed to be simple. Use 2-stage tanks and Techna scooters to explore the main passage. Alan wanted to get more comfortable using the scooter, so they planned to keep navigation easy and straightforward. One small concern lingered. Neither of them had dived in over a month. They worried they might be a little out of practice, but in the end, they felt confident enough to move forward. After checking their gear one last time, they took a deep breath and descended into the spring's depths. The first part of the dive went smoothly. A permanent guideline ran through the main passage, making navigation easy, and the crystal clear water gave them great visibility. But then, the first problem popped up. Milholland's scooter stopped working. Without it, he had to rely on his fins to move. He signaled to Alan, suggesting they call off the dive. But Alan was eager to keep going and insisted they continue. After thinking it over, Milholland agreed. Their plan was already simple. The water was calm, and the guideline was in perfect condition. It felt safe enough, and Alan was excited to get more practice with the scooter. At first, Alan struggled a little with the device. It looked awkward in his hands, and his movements were a bit shaky. But as they went deeper, he started getting the hang of it. The deeper they went, the darker it got. The sunlight from the surface was long gone, and now their dive lights were the only thing cutting through the pitch-black water. The cave walls started closing in, forcing them into a narrow passage. The water felt colder and heavier, and a faint current pushed against them, almost like the cave itself was warning them to turn back. Milholland kept an eye on Alan and noticed something concerning. He was a little too low in the water, close to the cave floor. As he moved, tiny clouds of silt puffed up behind him. Milholland made a mental note, but decided not to say anything yet. It looked like Alan was still adjusting to the scooter, so they kept moving. Eventually, the passage widened a little, but only for a moment before tightening again at a well-known spot called the Lips. This part of the cave was infamous among divers. The opening was narrow, and the current here was stronger, making it tough to get through. For anyone not prepared, the Lips could quickly turn from a simple challenge into a serious danger. Milholland had been through this section before. He knew it required steady hands, precise movements, and a calm mind. If Alan wanted to handle the scooter well, this would be the real test. As they got closer, the mood changed. The calm water they had been gliding through turned into a strong current, tugging at them like invisible hands. Tiny bits of silt swirled in the water, carried by the rushing flow. Milholland stopped and turned to Alan, flashing his dive light to signal a question. "Are you ready?" Alan answered confidently with an okay signal. But even after getting the response, Milholland couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Pushing it aside, he moved forward, positioning himself for the narrow section ahead. As soon as he entered, the current hit him even harder. Every movement took effort, like fighting against an unseen force. He stayed in control, using slow, careful kicks to push forward through the tight space. Finally, on the other side, the flow eased a little, and he turned to watch Alan follow. At first, everything looked fine. Alan moved forward cautiously, his dive light steady, but the moment he entered the Lips, the power of the scooter became a problem. Its propeller stirred up the already strong current, and suddenly, Alan struggled to stay in control. Milholland's stomach tightened as he saw Alan's light start to shake. The beam flickered wildly, bouncing off the cave walls in erratic patterns. Then, just like that, it vanished. Milholland froze. His mind raced. Was Alan stuck? Did he lose control of the scooter? Was he injured? The seconds dragged on like hours as he hovered in the water, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then, instinct took over. He spun around and swam back toward the narrow passage. The current was stronger than before, like it was actively pushing him away. Every kick of his fins felt like a battle. His breathing quickened as he forced himself forward, his dive light sweeping across the tunnel. It bounced off jagged rocks and uneven ground. But there was no sign of Alan. The passage felt even tighter now, like the cave itself was closing in. The rushing water pounded against him, making it painfully slow to move forward. When he finally made it through, he was met with nothing but darkness. Alan was gone. Milholland forced himself to stay calm. Years of training kicked in as he began a systematic search. He scanned the walls and floor, looking for anything. A cloud of disturbed silt, bubbles, movement. The cave, which had seemed beautiful just minutes ago, now felt like an endless void. The only sound was his own heavy breathing. Then, just as the first hints of panic crept in, he saw it, a faint glow from a side tunnel. Relief flooded him, and he rushed toward it. The passage led toward Devil's Eye Spring. Kicking as hard as he could, he closed the distance. But as he got closer, his relief turned to dread. The light was steady now, shining on Alan's unmoving figure. He floated in an unnatural position, his back arched, his regulator hanging loosely from his mouth. The sight hit Milholland like a punch to the gut. Reaching Alan, Milholland immediately checked his gear. His air supply was still good. His tanks and equipment were intact. But something had gone terribly wrong. There was no time to waste. Getting Alan to the surface would be tough, and Milholland had to work fast. He carefully removed Alan's tanks and gear, making him easier to move. Every motion had to be precise. One wrong move, and they could both get trapped in the narrow cave. Gripping Alan tightly, Milholland started the long, exhausting ascent. The current, which had been annoying before, now felt like an enemy, trying to pull them deeper. Every muscle in his body burned as he fought against it. His legs screamed in pain, but he didn't stop. His only focus was getting Alan out. The walls of the tunnel seemed to squeeze around them, making each kick feel harder. His breathing grew heavier, his air running lower with each second. Then, finally, he saw it. A faint glow ahead. The entrance. Summoning every last bit of strength, Milholland kicked harder, pushing toward the surface. As soon as he broke through the water, he shouted for help. Nearby, divers and emergency responders rushed in, pulling Alan from the water. An EMT and a physician immediately began resuscitation efforts. Their movements were sharp and professional, but the tension in the air was thick. Everyone held their breath, hoping for a miracle. But it was too late. Alan had been underwater for too long. His lifeless body lay on the shore, leaving everyone stunned and heartbroken. An investigation into the accident found several key issues. Alan's inexperience with the scooter was a major factor. Using one in a cave requires perfect buoyancy control and the ability to multitask under pressure. Alan may have overexerted himself, leading to a buildup of carbon dioxide in his system. This can cause confusion, panic, and poor decision-making, deadly in a cave. It was a warm summer evening on June 19, 1986, in Durango, Colorado. The kind of night that should have been about fun, laughter, and maybe a little harmless mischief. But for 4 teenagers, it turned into something much darker, a night they'd never be able to forget. Just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, the group decided to explore Bell Cavern, an old abandoned mine locals called Old Weaver Mine. Everyone in town knew it was dangerous with its crumbling walls and tight, twisting tunnels. But for 17-year-old Thad Shear, that was exactly why he wanted to go. He loved a challenge, especially one that came with a rush of adrenaline. By 8:30 p.m., they were deep inside the cave, about 200 feet from the entrance. The further they went, the colder and darker it got. The air felt heavy and damp, like the cave itself was breathing down their necks. They crawled over jagged rocks, squeezed through narrow gaps, and ducked under low ceilings, their nerves growing tighter with every step. Then, Thad spotted something that made his heart race, a narrow vertical shaft, barely 18 inches wide, disappearing into complete darkness. It was just big enough for someone daring, or maybe reckless, to climb down and see what was below. His friends tried to talk him out of it. "Thad, this is a bad idea," one of them said, their voice shaky. But Thad just flashed his trademark grin, brushing off their worries. "I'll be fine," he said, his confidence unshaken. Before anyone could stop him, he started climbing down. The shaft was tight, the rocks wet and loose. Thad pressed his arms and legs against the walls, inching his way down, his breathing loud and uneven in the cramped space. About 10 feet down, everything went wrong. The rocks beneath Thad shifted suddenly, and his foot slipped. His body twisted awkwardly, and with a sickening scrape of stone against stone, he got stuck, completely wedged in the narrow shaft. He pushed against the walls, trying to free himself, but it was no use. The more he struggled, the tighter the shaft seemed to hold him. His breathing became fast and shallow, the sound echoing up to his friends above. In less than a minute, he passed out, his body going still. One of his friends dropped to the edge of the shaft, shouting his name over and over. "Thad! Thad, can you hear me?" But there was no response, only silence from the darkness below. One of the group members knew they had to act fast. Without a second thought, he turned and ran through the maze-like cave, scrambling over rocks and squeezing through tight spaces. Finally, he burst out into the cool night air and sprinted to find a phone. It was almost 10 p.m. when he reached the La Plata County Sheriff's Office, breathless and desperate for help. Back in the cave, Thad's situation was getting worse by the minute. Stuck in the narrow shaft, he couldn't move, and the air around him was running out. The cave seemed to be crushing him, its cold, damp walls closing in. He was unconscious, his body limp, and the freezing temperature was making things even more dangerous. His friends could only wait in the heavy, suffocating silence, their flashlights flickering as they stared helplessly at Thad's motionless body trapped below. By 2 a.m., rescue teams from Leadville, Ouray, and Silverton arrived, ready for what would become one of the most challenging operations of their careers. They brought compressed air drills, hammers, and oxygen tanks, knowing every second mattered. But getting to Thad was no easy task. The cave was a maze of tight, twisting passages, some so narrow that rescuers had to crawl on their stomachs, dragging their heavy gear behind them. It was slow, exhausting work, but they pushed forward, determined to save him. At 3 o'clock a.m., Keith D., a 29-year-old veteran rescuer, tried to create a new opening near the shaft where Thad was trapped. The idea was to make another way to reach him. But the rocks were unstable, crumbling under the pressure of his tools. Then, disaster struck. The ground beneath Keith gave way. There were shouts of panic as he slipped, falling down the same vertical shaft Thad was stuck in. Then came the awful thud as he landed right on top of Thad, pushing him even deeper into the tight space. The rescue team was stunned. Keith had hit his head during the fall and was now unconscious. The narrow shaft, already a deadly trap, now held two bodies. It was a nightmare no one had imagined, a rescuer needing to be rescued. Keith's weight pressed down on Thad, making the already dangerous situation even worse. The tight space felt like a coffin, with Keith lying unconscious and Thad still unresponsive beneath him. In rescue missions, it's rare for the rescuers to end up in danger themselves, but this cave was different. It didn't care who you were or how experienced you were. What started as a mission to save Thad had turned into a desperate fight to save two lives. The team's plan was thrown into chaos, and every second felt like a battle against the cave itself. They didn't waste a moment. Oxygen tanks were rushed into the cave, passed carefully through the tight, freezing tunnels. Every movement was slow and deliberate, like trying to thread a needle in the dark. Tubes and masks were lowered into the shaft, the rescuers shouting instructions as they worked to get them onto Keith and Thad. Miraculously, the oxygen started to work. Keith was the first to stir, groaning in pain, his head wobbling weakly. Moments later, Thad's eyes flickered open. He looked dazed, his face pale and sweaty, as he gasped for air. For a brief moment, the rescuers felt a flicker of hope. Both men were alive, but they were in bad shape. The rescuers kept working, hammering and drilling to widen the shaft without causing more collapses. The tight space and freezing cold wore them down, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Thad and Keith were running out of time. By the time the sun began to rise, they had finally widened the shaft enough to try pulling them out. Nearly 12 hours had passed since Thad first got trapped. Keith was the first to be pulled out. His body was limp, his face twisted in pain. Medics rushed him to the surface, where they discovered he had a broken neck and fluid in his lungs. He was barely conscious, clinging to life by a thread. Thad came next. His body shook violently, weakened by the cold and the crushing pressure of being trapped for so long. The rescuers moved him carefully through the rough opening, taking their time to avoid causing more harm. When he finally emerged at 9:30 a.m., he was too weak to speak, his face pale as a sheet. Both men were alive, but the rescue had left everyone drained. The rescuers, bruised and exhausted, sat in silence, trying to process how close they had come to disaster. This mission would stay with them forever, a stark reminder of how quickly a routine job can turn into a nightmare. Keith needed serious medical care, and his recovery would be long and difficult. Thad, though deeply shaken, had made it through the terrible night thanks to the rescue team's tireless efforts. Tituna Cave sits about a mile from Arch Springs, Pennsylvania, shrouded in mystery. Originally called Arch Spring Cave, this underground maze has been part of local history since the 1750s, when European settlers first came to Sinking Valley. Local stories tell of Native Americans fleeing into the cave after killing 2 settlers. The Native Americans might have found another way out or died inside. No one has found another entrance, leading to ideas about a hidden escape route. Many people think a secret tunnel might link the cave to Arch Spring, about a quarter-mile away. Locals used to believe someone could escape capture by diving into the cave and slipping out through this hidden passage. No one has found proof of this idea, but the story lives on, adding to the cave's reputation as a mysterious and dangerous place. The cave's legend grew over time. Early descriptions talk about a narrow opening in a hillside that opens into a series of tunnels and rooms. These passages are hard to navigate, but if done right, explorers can reach a large chamber deep in the cave. Here, water rushes into a whirlpool so strong it pulls anything caught in it into what seems like a bottomless pit. In recent years, people tried twice to turn Tituna Cave into a tourist spot. In 1947 and 1972, investors attempted to make the cave visitor-friendly. The second try ended badly when a hurricane caused major flooding. Water rushed through the cave, destroying railings, steps, and paths. The damage was so bad that pieces of the project still litter the cave today, adding to its creepy, abandoned feel. Visitors often come to see the flood's aftermath, unaware of the hidden dangers inside. The cave stretches 3,500 feet and has several underwater tunnels called sumps. These pose a deadly threat to experienced cave divers and certain death for untrained explorers. The first sump lies 900 feet from the entrance, making the cave relatively safe to explore only up to that point. Beyond that, the risk of getting trapped or lost in the water increases greatly. Despite this danger, the thrill of exploring the unknown keeps drawing adventurers to Tituna Cave. Some hope for fame by discovering a new passage, while others simply crave the excitement and mystery. From 1984 to 1986, John Schweyen and Jim Brown, 2 skilled cave divers, took on Tituna Cave. They aimed to find a link to Arch Spring that others had missed. With better gear, they went deeper than anyone before. They found the 4th sump, a big, risky underwater tunnel dropping 80 feet deep. But they ran low on air and hit a wall they couldn't pass. They had to turn back. Not ready to quit, John and Jim tried from the Arch Spring side. It was riskier and less explored, but they hoped for a new path. They found a sump right at the entrance. They pushed on and hit a second sump matching Tituna Cave's water levels. It was long, deep, and hard to see in. John went down and found a tunnel 100 feet deep, way deeper than expected. But it was too dangerous to keep going. Poor visibility, cold water, and decompression needs made it impossible. They'd have to plan another dive when it was safer. John, from Glen Rock, New Jersey, was no rookie to tough cave dives. He was known for careful planning and determination. When Roberta Swisegood asked him to join her Tituna Cave trip, he jumped at the chance. Roberta had spent 4 years trying to prove Tituna Cave and Arch Spring were connected. John was eager to help solve this mystery. Roberta was a pioneer in cave exploration. At 36, she'd made a name for herself with successful dives in Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, and across the US. Roberta had already dived Tituna Cave 3 times, getting close to proving the Arch Spring connection. The pair geared up for their dive, double-checking their equipment. They knew the risks, but felt ready for the challenge. As they entered the cave, the cool air hit their faces. The darkness swallowed them whole as they moved deeper. Their lights cut through the gloom, revealing the cave's jagged walls and treacherous drops. They reached the first sump and plunged in. The water was ice cold and murky. They relied on touch more than sight, feeling their way through the narrow passages. Each turn brought new challenges: tight squeezes, sudden drops, and swirling currents that threatened to pull them off course. Hours passed as they pushed further into the cave. They mapped new areas, inching closer to their goal. But the cave seemed endless, full of twists and dead ends. Their air supplies dwindled, forcing them to make tough choices. They knew they were close, but the cave wasn't giving up its secrets easily. On June 19, 1988, John and Roberta launched their final push to connect the cave with Arch Spring. Their plan was straightforward. John would lead, laying a new dive line in Sump 2. Roberta would follow, taking measurements and surveying. At 1 p.m., John entered the cave and made for Sump 2. The water was cloudy with poor visibility, but he pushed on. He set up a new dive line and marked 2 spots where they might break through. Roberta dove in at 2:50 p.m., set on finishing her part. She followed John's line, measuring and checking for ways through the blockage. As she squeezed through tight spots, her suit tore on the jagged rocks. She kept going, knowing cold water would seep in and make things tougher. Deeper in, Roberta got tangled in the dive line. In the murky water, this was bad news. Silt clouds made it even harder to see. Her buoyancy compensator acted up, making it tough to stay in place. With no choice, she cut the line to free herself. Now, Roberta was in real trouble. Untethered and blind, she'd lost her lifeline. Her chances of finding the way out were slim. She swam hard, searching for the other dive line to safety. But it wasn't there. Time was running out, and her air was low. The cold water seeping into her torn suit brought on hypothermia. She knew she had to get out fast, but with zero visibility and no line, things looked grim. At 6:15 p.m., John started to worry outside the cave. Roberta should have surfaced by now. He went to town for more batteries, then entered the cave to look for her. When he couldn't find her, he called the state police and kicked off a rescue mission. The rescue team faced a race against time, battling the same treacherous conditions that had trapped Roberta. Every minute counted as they pushed deeper into the cave's twisting passages. As hours ticked by, the rescuers' determination grew. They knew the odds were stacking against them, but they refused to give up. They methodically searched every nook and cranny, aware that Roberta's life hung in the balance. The rescue effort drew national attention. News crews gathered at the cave entrance, broadcasting updates to a worried public. Fellow cavers and divers from across the country offered their help, bringing specialized equipment and expertise to the search. Renowned cave diver Bill Stone stepped in to lead the rescue team. They hoped Roberta had found an air pocket and was waiting for help. The team searched relentlessly, but John found Roberta's body on June 20th, just 10 feet from the safety line. She had been so close to escaping, but got disoriented and swam the wrong way. Recovering her body took days due to the cave's narrow, jagged passages. Finally, 6 divers, in teams of 2 and 3, brought her to the surface. Though Roberta's story ended tragically, her impact on cave exploration and diving safety lives on. Her drive to solve Tituna Cave's connection to Arch Spring was unmatched. The diving community she loved still honors her legacy. Nestled deep within the rugged landscapes of Norway's Rana municipality lies Plura Grata, the deepest and most extensive cave system in northern Europe. This underwater labyrinth is both a siren's call and a death trap for thrill-seeking cave divers from around the world. Its allure lies in the beauty of its vibrant, submerged caves. Yet beneath its surface, the Plura cave system hides a treacherous path that has claimed more than its fair share of lives, particularly during Norway's harsh winters when the surface of Lake Plura freezes over, encasing the entrance in a formidable barrier of ice. On February 6, 2014, 5 Finnish divers, seasoned veterans of the sport, embarked on a mission that would test their courage, skill, and resolve to the utmost limits. These men were not newcomers to the dangers of cave diving. They had faced the perils of the deep before, navigating through some of the most challenging underwater passages in Europe. However, this dive was different. It was to be the culmination of their experiences, pushing the boundaries of human endurance and testing the very limits of what was possible beneath the earth. Their destination was Steinlaflaga, a remote and perilous cave within the Plura system, accessed only through a network of narrow underwater tunnels. The dive was planned to take approximately 5 hours, with the men descending to depths exceeding 130 meters, far beyond the comfort zone of even the most experienced cave divers. For most amateur divers, an hour at 30 meters would be considered a significant achievement. But for these 5 men, this dive was an opportunity to achieve something extraordinary, something few others could claim. The expedition began in the early morning hours, with the men cutting a triangular hole in the ice covering Lake Plura. They slipped into the icy depths, encased in waterproof dry suits and laden with advanced diving equipment designed to withstand the extreme pressures and temperatures they would encounter. From the moment they entered the water, the risks were evident. The deeper they dove, the colder and darker the water became, the tunnels narrowing to the point where even a slight mistake could mean disaster. Jagged rocks protruding from the cave walls threatened to tear through their suits and equipment, while the ever-present danger of hypercapnia, a potentially deadly buildup of carbon dioxide, loomed large over the entire expedition. Patrick Grankvist led the group, a seasoned diver who, along with 2 others, had discovered the passage between Plura and Steinlaflaga the previous year. His close friend, Jari Hinen, accompanied him, attempting the full traverse for the first time. The dive began smoothly, with the men descending into the inky blackness of the cave, their path illuminated only by the beams of their flashlights. But as they reached the deepest section of the cave, 110 meters below the entrance, disaster struck. Grankvist realized that Hinen was no longer behind him. Panic gripped him as he circled back, searching desperately for his friend. When he finally found Hinen, he was trapped in a narrow section of the cave, ensnared by a cord from his diving equipment. Hinen was signaling frantically with his flashlight, the only way he could communicate his distress in the pitch-black water. Grankvist knew the danger his friend was in. Hinen was panicking, his breathing becoming erratic, which meant he was at serious risk of hypercapnia. Grankvist acted quickly, attempting to calm Hinen and offering him a gas cylinder to help reduce the carbon dioxide in his system. But as Hinen tried to switch mouthpieces, tragedy struck. His panic overwhelmed him, and he began to gasp for air, inadvertently inhaling water instead. Grankvist could only watch in horror as his friend drowned before his eyes, his struggles growing weaker until finally he was still. The shock of witnessing his friend's death was overwhelming, but Grankvist knew he had to control his own emotions and breathing to avoid the same fate. He could not afford to panic, not now, not here, deep within the heart of the cave. After a futile attempt to free Hinen's body, he realized he had no choice but to continue towards Steinlaflaga. The journey ahead was fraught with danger. Not only did he have to navigate the treacherous tunnels, but he also faced the risk of decompression sickness, a potentially deadly condition that could strike if he ascended too quickly after spending so much time at such extreme depths. As Grankvist pressed on, the second team of divers, led by Visa Ranin, was following behind. Ranin was the first to encounter Hinen's body, and he was faced with a gut-wrenching decision: turn back or continue. After weighing his options, he chose to press on, but the delay in navigating around the body added several hours to his decompression time. When Ranin finally surfaced, he was in agony, suffering from the early stages of decompression sickness. The pain in his joints, a common symptom of the condition, grew worse with each passing hour, a grim reminder of the dangers they faced in the depths. Meanwhile, the third diver, Jari Uzumaki, was dealing with his own nightmare. Upon discovering Hinen's lifeless body, Uzumaki panicked, his mind overwhelmed by the sight of his dead friend. In his terror, he overloaded his rebreather with carbon dioxide, a mistake that would prove fatal. Despite the efforts of the fifth diver, Kai Kenan, to assist him, Uzumaki could not regain control and drowned just 20 meters from where Hinen's body lay. Kenan, shaken but determined to survive, made the grueling journey back to the starting point, breaking through a thin layer of ice as he finally resurfaced nearly 11 hours after the dive began. All 3 surviving divers were immediately hospitalized with decompression sickness, their bodies racked with pain from the bends. Local authorities took their statements, and the Plura cave system was temporarily closed to prevent further tragedies. The loss of Hinen and Uzumaki sent shockwaves through the Finnish diving community, and word of the disaster soon reached Sami Pakarinen, a diving instructor and close friend of the deceased, who was teaching in Mexico at the time. Pakarinen spent hours on a Skype call with British cave diver Rick Stanton, a man renowned for his rescue and recovery work in some of the world's most dangerous underwater caves. Stanton had already heard about the accident and was preparing to assist in retrieving the bodies of the 2 divers. 2 weeks later, he, along with divers John Volin and Jason Mallison, made the arduous journey to Norway to begin the recovery operation. However, the mission proved more challenging than anticipated. The narrow passage where Hinen's body was lodged blocked access to Uzumaki, making it impossible to reach him from the Steinle-Flagge side of the tunnel. The divers considered returning to their point of origin and attempting to dive backward through the system, but the risks were too great. The recovery was called off, and the Norwegian police declared the operation too dangerous to continue. Devastated by the failure, but resolute in his determination, Grankvist made a solemn promise to Hinen's widow. He vowed to bring her husband's body back, no matter the cost. It was an unspoken code among divers. No one gets left behind, not even in death. This was a promise Grankvist intended to keep. Quietly, the surviving divers began planning a second unauthorized recovery mission. They knew that they would be denied permission if they asked, so they kept their preparations secret. On March 22, 2014, a team of 27 divers descended on Plura. This time, the operation was meticulously planned. 2 teams of support divers worked in the shallower areas of the cave, ensuring that the main team had everything they needed for the deep dive. Grankvist, Pakarinen, and Kenan were the ones who would go deep, risking everything to retrieve the bodies of their fallen friends. Volin, still recovering from his own injuries sustained during the previous attempt, managed surface operations, coordinating the efforts of the entire team. The recovery mission was grueling and fraught with danger, but after 3 days, the bodies of Jari Heinen and Jari Uzumaki were finally brought to the surface. The Norwegian police, while pleased that the bodies had been retrieved, made it clear that several rules had been broken in the process. But for the surviving divers, those concerns were secondary to the fulfillment of their vow.